Hey everyone, this is Christoph Limpelaer with ScaleYourCode.com, and today I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Thomas Griffin. Thomas is a WordPress developer, and if you've ever used WordPress, you've probably heard of his most popular plugin called Soliloquy. Soliloquy is known as the best responsive WordPress slider plugin. Thomas also developed Opt-in Monster, which is a plugin that helps you get more email subscribers. Now, in this interview, we'll talk about how Thomas got started developing plugins, and we'll deep dive into some of the challenges he ran into building both Soliloquy and Opt-in Monster. We're also going to talk about his WordPress core contributions, his workflow, and how to find the right business partners. With that being said, I'd like to welcome you, Thomas.
Hey, Christoph. Thank you for having me on the interview. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to get going on it.
Well, thanks for being on the show. So before we get started, and I told Thomas this, but I just battled the flu for a whole week. So if you hear my voice crack a little bit, or if you hear me clear it out or cough a little bit, sorry about that. Now let's get started. So just to introduce yourself to people who may not know who you are, can you give us a short pitch of what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, like you said, my name is Thomas Griffin. I'm the partner and CTO at Awesome Motive Inc. And so basically what I do on a day-to-day basis is I manage projects and actually build all the technical pieces of all the products that we sell. And so that would be Soliloquy, which Christoph has already introduced, Opt-in Monster, as well as Enviro Gallery and Theme Lab. And so pretty much during the day, I'm writing code, I'm reviewing code, I'm assigning code projects, pretty much anything and everything that has to do with code I'm doing throughout the day.
Sounds like fun to me. Do you still do any consulting work? I know you did some in the past.
I do that some on a very limited basis. Actually, I'm working with a rather big video game producer on one project, but it's related specifically to one of our products. So pretty much the only consulting work that I do now is either to barter for something. So if let's say I want to work with a lawyer and I need some legal document, I might barter with him a website for a legal document, or if it's some consulting for one of our products. But outside of that, it's pretty much all product based.
That sounds like a good deal. So let's dive right in with one question I'm always interested in asking a developer because I feel like it helps others, especially newer developers, relate more to you. And that is, how and why did you learn to code?
Yeah, yeah. So that makes for a good story. So this was back when I was in college. I was in school. I was working a job, but unfortunately, I was not making enough money to make ends meet. I was one of the legitimate poor college students. I was living off mac and cheese from my girlfriend, and I was like, man, this is not right. I don't like struggling from week to week. And so I picked up on a Sunday afternoon. I was trying to think of a way to make some extra money without having to get an actual job. And so I started writing content online. And gosh, this was back in 2008 or 9. And what I found was I made some money doing that, but then they owned all the content that I wrote. And I wanted to own and be known for the content that I wrote. And so I decided to create my own website. Now, I'd never really touched websites much before, and I didn't really know anything about programming languages or anything like that. I knew HTML from a high school class, but that was about it. I had no clue what CSS was or how to do any of that. And so somehow I stumbled upon WordPress, and they talked about the famous 5-minute installation.
Right.
And I thought, all right, if it really only takes 5 minutes, then I'm going to give this thing a shot. So I bought a website from GoDaddy. I bought hosting from iPage, I think. And then I went to try to install WordPress. And at that time, they didn't have all these fancy installers and everything. And so they were telling me that I needed to install it in the root folder of my site. And I literally spent 6 hours trying to figure out what a root folder was, and I gave up. I gave up literally for a month, and I thought I'd wasted $60 because I could not figure out what a root folder of a website was. And so it was depressing at first. And then I came back around to it about a month later. I said, you know what? I spent $60. I don't want to waste this. Let me give it a shot. So I think I spent another 6 hours, and finally, and I still don't know what I did. I figured out how to work this FTP thing that I'd never heard of, and I got it working. I got it installed. I got the database set up, and I was rolling. And I thought, okay, I'm finally making progress. So I started to build my own website. I started writing content. Well, I wasn't happy with some of the ways that this free theme that I was using with WordPress was displaying stuff. And so then I decided, well, there's probably some tutorials online. That's how I figured out how to install this website. So let me figure out how to tweak it. And I actually started to enjoy tweaking the theme more than writing the actual content. And so I continued to do that. I continued to learn a lot about SEO. From there, I heard about the thesis theme for WordPress. It was all the rage back then. And so I picked that up, and I got to learn about this hooks and filters thing. And I'd never heard of it before, and I'd never really done any PHP coding and programming before, but I was like, man, I can do some pretty cool stuff with this, and I don't actually have to change theme files, and I only mess with one file, and I kind of like that. And so through lots of trial and error and tutorials, I learned how to start working with hooks and filters in WordPress. And then I remember I fixed something, and somebody on the theme support directory area or forums needed some help with something. They said they'd pay $50 to fix it, and it was this exact thing that I had just done. And so I messaged the guy and said, "Hey, I can do that for you." Sent me $50. It took me 15 minutes, and it was fixed.
Wow.
And I thought, okay, if I can scale that, and if I can improve my process, and I can get better, then there's some real money to be made in this, and I really enjoy it already anyway. And that's kind of the long, short story of how I got into programming with WordPress.
So I bet you're pretty glad you didn't give up after that 1 month of not being able to find out the FTP root folder, right?
Oh my gosh, that was the most frustrating thing because I was really excited about this and wanting to write content, but I didn't really want to touch code at that time. And then just getting so frustrated with what in the world is FTP? What in the world is a root? This is completely foreign language to me. And then finally persevering, figuring it out, and that just opening up an entire new world of like, oh, I love this stuff. I always thought I'd like code because I used to tutor business statistics in college. And I thought, there's a lot of logic, there's a lot of math in this. I understand the concepts of this stuff. So if I can just persevere and figure it out, I think I'll really like it. And that's what happened. And then I just, the rest they say is history.
So knowing what you know now, if you could go back in time to accelerate this learning, what are 3 things you would tell yourself?
The first thing I would do is say, don't be afraid to ask questions. I was new to this, and I was a little bit timid in wanting to ask things. And from growing in that and looking back, what's the worst somebody's going to tell you? No. Or there's I call the internet. People are way more courageous on the internet than they are in real life. So if they pick at you or whatever, don't take it to heart. But just ask questions. There's lots of good knowledge out there. There's Stack Overflow out there, and people will want to help you and generally want you to succeed. So ask those questions to figure out, if you're having an issue getting stumped. Another thing to accelerate is just really, really use Google as your best friend. That Google is the largest index of information out there in the world. And there's so much information that is freely available to you. The problem is we just don't know how to search for it. And so, I've graduated from the School of Hard Knocks, and I can almost guarantee you any question that you have, it will be somewhere in a Google search. It may be 5 pages in the search. But what I've learned and what I wish I would have done sooner is that by doing that, you really learn all the routes not to take, and then you learn the route you need to take, and that helps you tremendously in the future because it helps you with debugging, so you're able to figure out what you've done wrong faster. Then it just gives you a better framework for processing and figuring out issues in your code, figuring out issues in other people's code, and just being able to figure out, well, okay, if I don't know it, now I know how to search for the issue. And so, really learning how to be a good steward of the resources that Google provides, I definitely would have done that. And then third, I wish I would have really followed. I wish I really followed more of the core WordPress stuff once I got into it,
Mhm.
and just looked at what they were committing and looked at what they were doing and how they were describing it, and just getting a feel for how is this done and how what is this WordPress way that everybody talks about. And I wish I would have really, I would have dove into that more because I think I would have gotten up to speed a lot faster than I did. Because I got started officially in 2010, but it really wasn't until 2011, even 2012, before I really started to grasp all these concepts of programming and they came together. And it's because I just got stuck in the rut of wanting to do this project and that project and that project, and not really taking my time to learn what other people were doing so that I could grow.
That's some really good advice, and I have to agree with studying the WordPress core and looking at all those comments because until I started doing that, and I still need to do a whole lot more of it, but until I started doing that, I really did not realize that some of these features existed, or even if I used the features, maybe I didn't use them properly or things like that. So, and by the way, for people listening to the audio version of this, or maybe you're driving to work or something, I'm going to put these as bullet points below the video to help you out because I think this is fantastic advice. Okay, so let's go ahead and start talking about Soliloquy because I have quite a few questions about that. So let's start with really what gave you the idea to build Soliloquy? Why did you start building it?
Yeah, so gosh, this was back in 2011. I'd been building a lot of client projects by this time, and every single one of them had a slider in it, every single one. And I kept having to try to figure out, okay, well, this slider can do this, but I really don't like how it's loading stuff on every single page, or this slider does that, but the interface is so confusing. I can never hand this off to a client. Where this does this, but it's so slow. The main big ones back then were I think the Nevo slider and slide deck,
Mm-hmm.
and I just had so many issues with them. But I kept having to build. I was like, well, I can't use these, so I'm just gonna have to build something custom. And I got to thinking, like, it's crazy building the same thing over and over again and not taking this and using it into something where instead of building it over and over, I just build it into a plugin, wrap it up, and then I just use it on each client project site. When I first had built it, that's really what it was for. It was for me to use on client project sites, and so I could speed up that process. So I could get done with projects faster, so that I could hand it off to a client, and then they would be, they could easily go in and they could change a picture, they could change the order of the pictures, they could change the link that the picture linked to, all that type of stuff that I didn't want to do when they called me and said, "Hey, can you change this?" And so, I got started in that, and Flex Slider was at the time pretty big, and so I was like, all right, well, I'll use this. It's a pretty good framework. It's pretty fast. It's good for mobile. Mobile is just starting to become popular, the responsive buzzword. And so I thought, all right, well, I'll go ahead and I'll do this. But at the same time, I'm going to make it to where it's fast and it's efficient and it's super easy to use for clients because I don't want them calling me and bugging me about little fixes I think they should do themselves. you know,
Right,
typical way a developer thinks.
right.
And so from there, I got to building it, got to piecing it together. A lot of trial and error, using it on a client project. And then one of my buddies, Jared Atchinson, he asked me and said, "Hey, can I use this for client work?" And I was like, "Well, yeah. I mean, that's fine." And I got to thinking, I'm like, okay, well, surely I'm not the only person out there who would see benefit in this. And if it's easy enough for clients to use it, then maybe it's easy enough for like the average user to use it too. And so that's when I thought, okay, well, let me figure out how to make a site and actually sell this thing. And so I spent more time learning how to, set up e-commerce stuff. I'd never done that before, and figuring out a licensing system because no licensing systems in WordPress existed then. And yeah, I got started in April 2012. That's when I launched it. And yeah, that was kind of the impetus for making it happen. Was just I kept doing it over and over for client projects, and I got tired of doing that.
Mhm. Okay. So how long did you develop on WordPress or consult on WordPress before you were able to build a word or a plugin like this?
Yeah, I started officially in September of 2010, and
Okay.
then I launched Soliloquy in April of 2012.
Okay.
So I guess it was a year and a half. I guess
Yeah.
that's would
Mhm.
be
About.
about a year and a half.
Mhm. Okay. And was it difficult to take something, specifically a plugin that you write for a specific client, and extracting that and making it work on all these other websites? I mean, there's so many different variables you have to account for. How
Yeah.
hard was that?
Yes, especially if you've never done it before. You
Mhm.
figure you learn very quickly how selfishly you code when you never do stuff that's meant to be distributed to the public. And so you really have to think about a lot of different scenarios. You have to think, okay, well, people are going to use it this way. Well, this is how I use it, but somebody else might use it in a different way. And so I need to prepare, I need to prepare the slider
Mhm.
for them. And I was like, well, part of that has to be hooks and filters because there was really no big movement for a plugin to have hooks and filters. That type of stuff wasn't really at the forefront of the conversation. So I thought, all right, well, WordPress has this awesome API, in the core. Why don't I use this in a plugin too? And that way, people have access to make it into what they would like. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, and it was tough. It's tough trying to think of all the different scenarios. And it's still tough now because you never know how somebody's going to use it, and they're going to use it in the weirdest and oddest way, and it's something that you've just got to try to think and prepare for.
Mhm. Do you have any examples of kinds of issues that you never thought were going to be possible, or that you never even thought of fixing before you released this?
Oh gosh. Well, I am not a server architect at all.
Mhm.
And so, I never really thought to, all right, well, how's 100, uh, how's it going to be when somebody's trying to upload 500 images at one time into their slider and use it? And I thought, who in the world would use 500 images? Like, that's crazy.
Right.
Nobody else does that. And just like crazy things like that of
Mhm.
thinking, why would I ever, but apparently somebody wants to do it. And so, all right, well, I got to try to figure out how to handle it.
Mhm.
But yeah, and stuff like that. I mean, you just, well, I'm not really prepared for it, but now somebody's doing it. So let's see if I can make it to where it'll
Mhm.
work for them. So,
And yeah, that's pretty funny. 500 images at the same time. I noticed you've got some pretty extensive documentation, especially for Soliloquy. Did
mhm.
you do this as a strategy or as a result of questions and the need for it through your support system?
A little bit of both. And to be honest, we've done a lot of work with documentation as of lately to try to improve that.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things now, CTO of Automotive that I really want to focus on is that onboarding process for a user. Because that first experience that you have with a user is so critical to your product. And you need to go above and beyond in your documentation and your code and all that to make sure that their experience is good and they can find what they need. You see this with DigitalOcean.
Mhm.
DigitalOcean has completely taken over the VPS world, and I think the number one reason is because there's so much
Mhm.
documentation for it. That the average Joe Schmo can figure out how to set up your typical, PHP, FPM, Nginx,
Mhm.
Memcache, Redis, all that, on a DigitalOcean box. Whereas a few years ago, like, who in the world's going to figure out how to do that?
Right. Right.
And that's because their documentation is so thorough and so good. And so I knew documentation was important when I first started, but when you're a one man show, there's only so much that you can do and legitimately focus on. And so I didn't see it as important as I see it now. And so
Mhm.
now it is definitely a strategy. And, especially that onboarding and making sure that creating your first slider, doing this, how to debug this, how to ask for support, how to do these basic things, how to use a particular add-ons. Those are incredibly important.
I agree entirely. In fact, when I first started looking at Nginx, I always, at the back of my mind, I thought, okay, this is pretty intimidating, right? This is a new type of web server. Actually, it's not that new, but to me it was. And Apache had so much documentation and so many tutorials. But then I went on the Nginx documentation, and it was so thorough that I was able to figure it out. I was
Yep,
able to play around with it and do that kind of thing. But if it wasn't for the documentation, like you said, the first experience is incredibly important. I would probably moved on and stayed with Apache. So, really
exactly.
good example, yeah.
Yeah, and I think too, like I think it's another reason why Laravel has become so popular
Hmm.
too, because their documentation is incredibly thorough,
Oh yeah.
and not only thorough, but it's documentation for stuff that you typically want to do. It's not this obscure documentation that only a couple people are going to use, but it's really beneficial for the majority of people using your software.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm. Yeah, I think Laravel is a great framework. I really enjoy working with it.
hmm.
So this is one of my favorite questions here. How do you ensure that Soliloquy is responsive and works for every screen? This is something I've struggled with. I still struggle with. Do you have any tips for us?
One, I'm confident that it will never work perfectly on every device. So and that's something that as a developer is really a tough pill to swallow.
Mhm.
It is tough to think that something that you've built and put so much time in is not going to work everywhere just as you imagine. And that's something that you're just going to have to work through, and you're going to have to accept and constantly work to improve. Your software application is never going to work as you imagine on every single device. They're just too many variables that you can't account for. And so what you have to do is you have to try to take one, if there's the most standards compliant way, then you try to figure out, all right, let me try to figure out the most standards compliant way to do this. And then once you do that, then you go and say, okay, this is going to hurt my developer's soul. But for the users using this specific, thing, maybe it's IE7. I've got to implement this hack. And then you've got to think, okay, what do I elevate more? Am I going to elevate the pride of my code and say, no, you can't do this? Or am I going to elevate and empower the user and say, well, look, I know this isn't technically right for code, but this fixes the problem for my user and it makes my user happy. That's something that you're going to have to figure out. And that's something that I struggled with too when I first started, because I was a purist. I didn't want to do that. But then I thought, you know what? They're out there depending on my product to help run their business, to help grow their sales, whatever. It's in my best interest to make sure that they succeed, because that means they're going to talk about my product. They're going to continue to pay, continue to renew licenses. And so if they want that, I'm going to find a way to do that, even if it means I have to write something I would consider a hack.
Mhm. Yeah, like you said, it hurts my soul sometimes to write some of these hacks. I mean, it's just it's crazy sometimes what you have to do, especially for IE7 or IE8 or
Yeah.
I mean
And,
they'll.
and you have to realize that the internet is an incredibly young industry.
Mhm.
The internet, it's been around what, 20 years, and in the scheme of things, that is a very, very young and immature
Mhm.
industry. And it hasn't had time to really figure out how are people going to really use this, and how can we build standards around that everybody can implement. And so, it's part of a necessity for something that's young and maturing.
Yeah, I like that way of looking at it. Thanks for the advice. So my next question has to do with speed. That's another thing I'm really interested in is making things faster, making the web faster. And I've worked on a gallery before where I would have to load all these images, and it's a slow loading process. And even after they're cached, it's faster at loading. Then you click on it, and you have all the animations, and everything just slows down. But I've played around with your Soliloquy plugin, and also your, I think, is it Envira?
Envira, yeah.
Envira. And they're really fast. And I looked it up, and apparently you use something you call asynchronous AJAX preloading. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about that? Can you give us more detail about that?
Yeah, so that was kind of the term that I came up with. It's called dynamic asynchronous AJAX preloading,
Okay.
which is a really fancy term for saying I'm not going to load every single image on the page load, but I'm going to let JavaScript handle that for me because users don't have to see every image on the page load. Like, so this was a light bulb moment for me when I thought, okay, this is a slider. Now in this slider, I didn't have carousels or anything like that yet, and I worked it to make it happen and worked with carousels. But in the slider, okay, there's only one image showing at one time. Okay, if there's only one image showing at one time, why am I loading 15 on the page at one time when they're only going to see one when the page initially loads?
Right.
Okay, now that I've got that, now that I know that the user doesn't need to see these other 14 images, now I just want to figure out a way, okay, how can I do it to where it's still going to load this stuff in, and I can load it in the background as everything else is continuing in the waterfall. And so basically what I do is I say, okay, I'm going to load the very first image in the slider. I'm going to figure out what it is. I'm going to load it. Everything else is going to be used with JavaScript. JavaScript is going to go through, so I'm going to add a data attribute that has the actual image link that needs to be loaded. And instead of actually loading the actual image, I'm just going to load a 1 pixel by 1 pixel GIF file, so kind of the smallest thing that I can find, just as a holder, so that it's not going to throw parse errors or any type of errors like that. And then I'm going to use JavaScript to just loop through these images. I'm going to grab them and I'm going to actually load them into the DOM whenever the page loads. And so that's kind of the idea behind the asynchronous AJAX preloading. So it's really not that crazy of a concept. It was just okay, well, the user doesn't need to see 15 at one time. Well, let's fix that. And that's kind of how it came to be. And then no other sliders were doing it. And I thought, well, that's kind of odd. I can really win on speed here. And you consistently find that nobody beats Soliloquy in speed because of it.
And so that gave you a pretty nice boost, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would take a page load down, and again, you look at the whole waterfall of the page. The entire page might, with the traditional method of, let's say you got 15 images, the entire page might take 5 seconds to load, right? And that's when everything is loaded in. You have your DOM content loaded, and then your window loaded, or whatever the term is, and they'll both be right there. Let's say it's 6 or 7 seconds. Well, now with the asynchronous AJAX preloading, the window load, so the full load, is still 7 seconds, but that DOM loading stuff is now down to like 500 milliseconds, right? So that's when the user starts to see stuff, and that's way, way, way faster than the other method. And so that's really how I got to see. So it's not only is it loading faster anyway, but it's also perceived to be loading faster by the user too, which is just as important.
So that should really be the standard. Everybody should be doing this. Sounds great. It reminds me of, I've seen some of these plugins where you have the infinite scroll. It's kind of the same deal, right? Okay. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And to the infinite scroll thing, it's a little tangent. I'll only take a minute on it. The infinite scroll thing too is a user type thing. Users, you get so used to flicking on your phone and scrolling up and seeing new content on your Facebook apps and Twitter and whatever, that it makes perfect sense to implement this on your website. And I mean, the engagement rates are so much higher. They stay on your website so much higher, or so much longer. So I mean, it just made sense. So, but it also has the added effect of making it load a lot faster for your site.
Okay, cool. One more question on Soliloquy, and then we'll move on to Opt-in Monster. This is another thing I read on your blog. You were saying that you had a client that came to you and said, or somebody that was using Soliloquy, that came to you and said that it was taking too long to load. And you figured out that actually ads were blocking it. And so, if I'm not mistaken, you said you switched from window onload to document.ready, right? Now,
Yes.
if I'm not mistaken, again, isn't window onload the one you're supposed to use to figure out the height and width of images? Like they're not loaded yet, right? So how did you get
Yes.
around that by using document.ready?
Yeah, that's correct. So you do not know the width and height of an image until the window.load uh, um, event has begun.
Right. Okay.
But also, there's the adverse effect of, well, ad scripts will block and are blocking scripts, and so they're going to slow down the process of window.load actually firing. But
Okay.
document.ready doesn't have that issue. But like you said, the problem is, well, images and the widths and heights aren't actually figured out there. And so one of the ways to get around this was, one, you can define a slider width and height inside of your settings. And so
Okay.
I would take that width and height, I would preload that image as soon as jQuery is available. I would preload that image into the DOM, but not actually use it, and try to figure out and try to guess what the best width and height was.
Okay.
And then before actually document ready was fired, I would make an attempt to set the height of the slider based on that. And so, and it actually works in most browsers. And so I take the height that I've got here, and then you just use a little bit of math to round and figure out, okay, well, if this is the height they want and here's the width of the screen, then I'm going to use a little bit of math and ratios to figure out, all right, this is probably the height that it's going to be. And so that's what I set it at. And then I just use a very, very subtle animation that will pull in once the actual height is figured out to actually put it in the height. And again, this stuff is happening in millisecond time.
Mm-hmm.
So it might take 100 milliseconds after I've set that initial height to figure out, okay, this is exactly the height it needs to be. And so for perceiving from the user, they never see this. So they just see the image actually on the page.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of how I got around it. Again, it's a perception thing. They perceive that the image is fully loaded, that everything is height and ready and set. That's not the case when it loads. It does it in the background, but it's so subtle that you never actually see it happen.
Neat, very neat feature. So let's talk about Opt-in Monster.
Mm-hmm.
I hear it wasn't an overnight success like some people thought. What happened with the servers?
Yeah, so we thought, okay, we have this great idea for this plugin. The opt-in industry is very spammy, and there's no good product in it. We have, I've got a reputation for building good stuff. I really think we can build something good here and have a successful product in it. But I don't want to limit it to WordPress. Let's make it everywhere. So let's build a SaaS platform. And I was like, so I remember Syed asked me, well, do you have experience with this? I was like, nah, but I'll figure it out. and so we got a box set up on Linode. I had some load balancers and stuff set up on it, and we were tracking analytics and all that type of stuff. It was working. It was running. We're using Memcached and Redis, using transients and WordPress to try to help speed up API calls. And we had stuff running actually really quickly. So grabbing the data and everything was fast. It was fine.
Mm-hmm.
What killed us, and as we got started, so we started loading it on WP Beginner and List 25. Having that many writes to a database that isn't a dedicated database, that doesn't have a lot of power to it, will cramp your server and completely kill it, no matter how many load balancers you have. When you're literally doing millions of writes, in a matter of a few hours, that's kind of tough to scale. And I didn't know anything about how to do any of that. We were scrambling, literally scrambling. And I was like, we just spent all this time doing this. And so, we quickly found out that, okay, I'm not cut out for this yet. I would love to learn how to do it, but now is not the time when we actually have said we are going to launch on this date, and we can't do it this way. Thankfully, I built it on WordPress, and so I was able to port a lot of the code into a plugin, and we took maybe three weeks or so to actually get it into a plugin that was released. So yeah, scaling is a real thing, and it's a real issue that you got to figure out, especially if you're handling your own analytics and writing to database. I mean, that's a lot of stuff to really work to figure out. And I've learned a little bit more about handling it since then, but at the time, I was way in over my head.
Hmm. Sounds like a crazy experience, that's for sure.
Yeah, that is for certain.
But it's a way of reminding people that even if you have all these things that are prepared and scaled, that you think they're scaled, you have to think of every single piece. It's not just because you have all those load balancers or you have all these web servers or whatever. If you don't have the database that's ready, it's going to crash. That's a
Yeah,
perfect example
yeah,
of it.
exactly. Just
Mm-hmm.
there are lots of different pieces and moving parts, and if you haven't set or configured up each one of them correctly, like what we were doing, some a lot of master to master replication and all this, and I mean, it just we couldn't handle it,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where I was like, all right, I got to throw up the white flag. I give in.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have
Mm-hmm.
to come back at this at another time and really figure out, okay, how to really scale this. On the flip side, it's really nice to know and really nice to test against your stuff on sites with incredibly high traffic, like both of those. So,
Yeah, I guess it sucks when that happens, but it kind of feels good too because you have so many rights. I'm sure that's a pretty good feeling to have so much going on and all
hmm
these users using it. I'm sure that was a great and bad feeling at the same time,
yeah,
bittersweet.
trial by fire.
That's right. So I'm really curious about your workflow. And what I mean by workflow is, first of all, how do you begin to work on a project? So maybe something like Soliloquy or Opt-in Monster. Where do you start? Do you take a pencil and paper and start writing down some ideas for class designs, or do you just start coding? How does it work with you?
So I've worked a lot to really refine this process over the years. When I first started with Soliloquy, it was not long after I'd launched TGM plugin activation. I'd done that, and I'd really gotten my feet wet with the kind of the object-oriented type programming. And so I'd been learning a lot about PSR zero auto loading at the time, and so I was like, all right, well that makes sense. Let me try to implement that and use that. And so at that time, I was like, all right, well, this technique sounds good. Let me run with that. And so I would start with, okay, well, I need the base plugin. I need to go ahead and create that. So I built that, and then I was like, all right, well, I need this piece, so I'll build this piece. Then it was really a piecemeal type of approach. As I've matured in product development, and now that we've launched 4 successful product platforms, now when we go and look for an actual product platform, okay, what's our next product that we want to do? I actually sit out and I map out and I try to think of pretty much everything that we're going to need for it, including here's the different types of files that we might need to create. Here's the types of interfaces that we're going to need. Here's the payment system that we need. Here's the license structure that we need. Here's the update server that we need. We need an API server. We're going to need this type of database structure.
Mm-hmm.
I try to figure all of that out first and try to work from that. And fortunately, I've had enough experience now to where I can pretty much expect and know, okay, this is what I'm going to need for this project. And then we've been using Basecamp, and I just start and I create lots of different to-do lists, and I add everything out, and I try to be as thorough and commenting on stuff as I can. I try to start signing people and assigning dates to things, and then I say, okay, here we go. Let's start on this chunk, and let's build this interface. And for this interface, I'm going to build this file, and I need this and this, and we start from there. And we have some internal boilerplates that we have now for
Okay.
plugins and getting things running and rolling. But now that's pretty much the process.
Cool. Yeah, Basecamp is a really good tool. I've used it. I still use it to this day, and it's a fantastic tool. So I highly recommend it as well. So this is a question I've wanted to ask you. We exchanged a few emails a few months back, and I had mentioned your work contributing on the core, the
Yeah,
WordPress core.
yeah.
Um, when did you do this? I mean, how long did it take you to get comfortable enough with WordPress to contribute to the core? Because to me, it's a pretty terrifying thought. So,
Yes, that was exactly the word I was thinking of. Terrifying. You know, you see all these people doing all this stuff, and how in the world do I get started with doing this? You know, I'm just a little guy that's learning, and I surely don't know the best ways to do things,
Right, yeah.
but I do know how to make things work. And so, you know, I built the TGM plugin activation, and one of the first things I'd noticed was that the file system was not handling something properly. And so I went in and submitted a ticket, and you know, and I don't think that particular ticket actually still has been resolved. I mean, there's a patch that's been on there for years, you know, but you know, for whatever reason they haven't committed it yet. But I got my feet wet into that, and I got to looking at track and how conversations would go and all that. And so I started looking for things, even if they were small things, to figure out and get my feet comfortable with doing this. I think one of my first patches was like a CSS fix. You know, it wasn't anything crazy, but it definitely fixed a bug. And then I got into a few different PHP fixes, and then a few other things here and there. But you know, just one of the best ways to get into it is read and start looking through the commits. So see what people are committing, look at the issues and see how discussion goes on it, and then say, hey, okay, here's the issue. You know, do your best to provide the steps to reproduce the issue, and then provide a patch. And it may not be the best work ever. It may be that your patch doesn't actually get submitted, but you still get credit for it because you you know you presented the issue, you conversed with the issue, you may have helped the developer, whoever did it, work out a bug in one of their patches to get the final patch working, and and you still get credited for submitting something. So just dive in, get your feet wet, read about it, submit something, and then take the feedback and start to learn from there.
All right, this is a promise I'm making on video here, so this goes on the record forever. I will at least contribute one time this year to the core, even if it's a small change. I will do it this year. All right, mark my words.
You can do it.
Thank you. Thank you for the advice and the encouragement.
Sure.
All right, to wrap up this interview, I want to ask you one more question, which I think is incredibly important.
Yeah.
How do you find the right business partner?
Oh gosh. That is a very very good question. Um, so if you do not know, Syed Balki from WP Beginner is my business partner. He is one of the smartest and most brilliant business people that I know. Um, and really, what made sense for us was one, you have to realize that you have a fatal flaw. There is something in you that does not function uh, to its optimal level. And what I mean by that is, whether it's your ability to cast vision for the future, whether it's a creative ability, there's some type of fatal flaw in you that you're not going to be able to fix, at least immediately, or it's not something that's going to ever come easy. You're going to have to work at to address. And so for me, I'm not very good at marketing. And I'm not very good at casting a vision and seeing where things are headed. That is not my strong suit in my skill set. I'm very good at taking an idea and building it in such a way that it's easy for people to use, it's fast, and all that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so, well, Syed, he's got that vision. He's very good at casting vision. He's creative, so he's really good at designing stuff, and he's a good marketer. He understands how to market and sell to people, which I didn't have. I had great products, but I didn't know how to sell them. And that's a crucial piece. If you want a successful product, you got to figure out how to sell it to your users. And so when I started pulling this together and figuring that out, I was like, man, okay, he really complements my skill set. With the areas that I'm weak, he is really, really strong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons why our partnership has been so good and we work so well together. Because where he might be weak, I'm a lot stronger, and where I'm weak, he's a lot stronger. And so we can both pull each other up by that and grow together and lead well with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as far as finding a business partner, don't find somebody that's just like you. Find somebody with a skill set that's different from you that's going to complement yours. From that, find somebody who shares the same business principles that you. If you are debt averse and your business partner is $100,000 in debt and loving it, do not partner with him. It is going to cause way more conflict than you could ever imagine. Sit down and honestly talk with one another and say, okay, what is your philosophy behind business? How do you see growth? How do you see growth? What's going to happen in 3 years if we grow and our company is doing $10 million in revenue? How are your values and all that are now going to be affected by that? How do you envision hiring people? What does it look like with communication? These things are very important. And so sit down and figure that type of stuff out. And finally, you got to like the guy or girl, whoever it might be. You're going to be working with them intimately on a day-to-day basis. That if you don't like them, uh, getting together and putting together a product and selling it and where money is going to be involved is not going to make that any better. So I would take those few things. Find somebody who's going to compliment you, find somebody who shares the same business principles and values, then find somebody that you actually like.
And see, Syed actually wrote a blog post about this that I really, really liked, so I'll go ahead and link that up below the video as well. If people are interested, they can go to it. I know this is a pretty important topic, like you said, very important topic. Well, Thomas, thank you so much for your time and wisdom. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I hope I've given a few nuggets of wisdom that people can latch onto.
Oh, definitely. And to all the viewers, please leave comments. And like you said, if there's anything he said in this video that helped you out, please leave a comment about it. If they want to get in touch with you, how would you recommend they do that?
Sure. So I try to stay pretty active on Twitter. I read Twitter pretty much every day. So you can find me at Thomas Griffin. So that's all one word. Or you can find me on my website, thomasgriffin.io. There's contact form there if you'd like to get in touch. And I'd love to connect and figure out some cool things that you're doing and any way I can help.
Perfect. Thank you all for watching, and thank you for being a part of it.